And welcome to Public Lectures at the APS. I am Annie Westcott. I am the Director of Meetings. And as I look out, I happily see a lot of familiar faces. So what do you think of our new decor? You like it? We're pleased as well. We're getting used to it, but we are pleased as well. This is its first public program. We are very pleased that you are here this evening. We know that there were other interesting opportunities for your time. I believe there's a Phillies game tonight, an NFL football game tonight, and there may be some debate going on down. Yeah. Let me tell you that you have made the right choice to be with us this evening. We have a good program, and if I may include one more sort of family remark, I hope that you will join me in a round of applause for our executive officer, Bob Hauser, who is joining us. This is his very first public appearance since having knee surgery 2 weeks ago. So we knew we wouldn't be able to keep you away for too long, Bob. So this evening we are going to get to visit Madison Park, Alabama, and we are going to get to see this community through the eyes of one of its beloved favorite sons, and that's Eric Motley. Eric is a graduate of Samford University and earned a PhD in International Studies from St. Andrews University in Scotland. And then at the fine age of 27, he became the youngest appointee to the Bush 43 White House as a senior advisor. So. Eric now is the Executive Vice President of the Aspen Institute, where he is in charge of governance and institutional advancement. And now, fess up. How many of you are familiar with the Aspen Institute? Okay, that's what I sort of thought. Good for you. The Aspen Institute is based in DC, founded in Aspen, but based in DC, has an amazing facility right on the Wye River in Maryland. But what the Institute does is it brings together thoughtful, creative, accomplished people to really look at the big, complex questions that we all need to face. But what makes the Institute particularly unique is that they take those conversations and they work to bring them real-time, real-world exposure. The Aspen Institute is a serious, influential organization, and Eric is one of the individuals that makes it go. Now, in terms of our format this evening, we thought that perhaps a conversation might be fun. So we've enlisted Patrick Spiro. I suspect that and hope that you all know Patrick. Dr. Spiro is a historian and an acclaimed author, and he's also the librarian for the American Philosophical Society. So as these two gentlemen join me on stage, and all of you turn off your cell phones, I will turn the program over to our good guest this evening, and Patrick.
Annie, thank you so much.
Oh, you're so welcome.
Great introduction.
Good,
Thank you.
You're also there. Right here. Yep. That's good. Well, thank you all for coming tonight. I'm thrilled to talk with somebody who I've gotten to know through a variety of professional experiences. Both Eric and I sit on the cabinet of the library at George Washington's Mount Vernon, George Washington's Presidential Library. And while serving with Eric, I've gotten to know him and his interests, but I didn't know much about his background until I heard about his book, his extremely well-reviewed biography, memoir, and almost a biography of the town in which you grew up in, called Madison Park. Now, I have to admit, I had not heard of Madison Park before I saw your book. And in fact, one of the stories you relate in your book is that a lot of people haven't heard of Madison Park. But you have been one of its greatest promoters. You relate in the end of the book a story in which one of your close friends in D.C. was talking to a high-powered lawyer from Montgomery in Alabama and said, "You must know Madison Park." And he had no idea what Madison Park was. And it was at that moment in your book that you called it an invisible community, but a community that is the type of community that's essential to America and our national community. And I was wondering if you could take our guests today to Madison Park and tell us a little bit more about its history, about what it was like, and why you decided to write a book about it.
Thank you so much, Patrick. Good evening. I should first acknowledge the great introduction that Annie gave, and I should say thank you for that wonderful plug on the Aspen Institute. And one of the most brilliant individuals that populate our stage every year to engage people in serious dialogue is Jeffrey Rosen. So to have you on the front row here tonight is quite a pleasure. And Patrick, it's been a real honor, and my assistant saw American Philosophical Society on my schedule and thought, there you go, trying to be smart again. So thank you for the opportunity of trying to be smart. You're right, you actually read the book if you actually saw that story, because it's at the very end. If you got your navigational system, your GPS, and you enter at Madison Park, the likelihood is that you would never find it. It's one of those places that's not programmed, but it's very much alive, and it's very much a part of the American fabric, and we're discovering that more and more now. Madison Park is a book, it's really, I started thinking last night with a friend, it's a love affair that just will not let me go. It's about a place, it's about a people, it's about experiences, it's about relationships, experiences, and memories, REM, that's not rapid eye movement. And it's a story about how a group of freed slaves in 1880, with nothing except the clothes on their back and a little money that they had saved, and a great appetite to live life fully and freely, came together and pooled what little resources they had to purchase a plantation. And this is what we know. It's probably the first plantation ever to be purchased by a group of freed slaves. And it's in Montgomery, Alabama, but almost on the outskirts of Montgomery, Alabama, as you're going to Wetumpka, another place you've probably never heard of. And it was about 1,000 acres initially, and then eventually they started to acquire more land. And there was one individual from the original pack where all of these freed slaves had been living on a larger plantation elsewhere, named Eli Madison. And Madison was not his own name, it was the name of his master. And Eli was gregarious, he could read, he could write, and he excited a group of slaves to realize that by working together and pooling their resources together, they could truly live into this idea of the American dream. They had heard about it. They had heard other people talking about it. Perhaps Eli Madison had even seen the words, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, and that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." And so, why is Madison Park so important to me? It's important to me because my grandfather's grandfather was a part of that original pack of freed slaves that Eli invited to be a part of this formation of a community. And on an early spring morning, they gathered in this open park, and they said a prayer, and they made a pact to one another, and that was to live in community. Not to be a statistic, but to create a community. And to create something like Martin Luther King said, we're all a part of an inescapable network of mutuality. We're all tied in a single garment of destiny. And for them, it was about relationships. It was about supporting one another and manifesting this larger idea of what it could be to be a freed American.
Yeah, that's great. And you subtitled the book, A Place of Hope.
Yeah.
Can you talk about how Madison Park is that place of hope today? And one of the other things you end on in one of the final chapters is almost some worry about the future of Madison Park. And I think the worry about Madison Park is also a worry that you seem to have for the nation as a whole, that as we become more atomized, as you say, places like Madison Park are under threat. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
I will. I should say that no place Community is rather abstract. It's all about the people. Every association that you're a part of, it's about the people you want to be with and the people you don't want to be with. And you don't always get the choice. And so they chose the people they wanted to be with, and they created this community. These grandparents of mine, my grandfather's grandfather, if I could tell you just a bit there, my grandfather's grandfather was John Wesley Motley. And John Wesley Motley had great aspirations for his own grandson. And that grandson was named by him George Washington Motley. And he told him, every time you write your name, you write your full name, George Washington Motley. And I would say, give me your initials on my report card, George Washington Motley. And he was named George Washington Motley to remind him of his own birthright, that you're no less than the trees and the stars, and you have a right to be here, and whether or not you realize that the world is unfolding just as it should. And my grandfather grew up on that same piece of land that his grandfather's father had inherited and had formed in 1880. I, to my good fortune, grew up on that same piece of land. And so the Motleys were not and are not my biological grandparents. The Motleys, George Washington Motley and his wife Mamie, never had kids of their own. They had a neighbor who was dying of cancer, and she had 14 kids, and her husband was totally overwhelmed. And they knew that the Motleys had always wanted a child but could not bear. And so they asked the Motleys if they would consider adopting one of their children. I don't know how you choose which one of 14 to surrender, but they actually thought that Barbara Ann Perry, who later became Barbara Ann Motley, had some promise and potential, and that if nurtured and brought up in the right environment, she could realize her potential more fully. And so this couple, already in their 40s, adopt this little girl at age 9. This is community, right? This is community. We're here for you. They adopt this little girl at age 9, and they invest all of their energies in her upbringing. Well, at age 19, Patrick, she gave birth to a bundle of unformed possibility. If you're slow, that's me. This is the American Philosophical Society. I expect you to get my jokes. And so she was unmarried. She was a mother of a new child, and she was living with her adopted parents. And Mamie and George Washington Motley decided, perhaps this is our opportunity to really get it right. And they were already in their late 50s, and they decided that they would adopt me, and they would rear us in that house. And no one on Motley Drive, because it was a first drive going through the plantation, no one in the family, no one had really ever graduated from high school. No one had ever gone to college. And so my grandfather had these 3 great desires, that one, I would realize that I was created by something much larger than myself. There was a God superintending all things. Secondly, that I would realize that I was a part of a network, a community, the community of Madison Park, that we were all in this together. And thirdly, that I would enjoy the benefit of enlightenment that only an education could provide. And so in this small town of Madison Park, everyone knew that the Motleys had a little boy that was going to go to college. I didn't decide I wanted to go to college. They decided I needed to go to college. And I became the community project. And if I could just take a diversion here, I was known as Little Einstein. I don't know if any of them actually knew who Einstein was, but they knew he was a pretty interesting guy. I was precocious. I asked a lot of questions. And at an early age, I became kind of a nerd. And eventually, I became the Duke, the designated university kid. And I was supposedly the smartest kid in the neighborhood until I went to first grade. And the teacher wrote a note home to my grandmother informing her that I had been demoted from the rabbits to the turtles. This is pre-political correctness, when you could call kids rabbits and turtles based on their speed of reading. And my grandmother was devastated when she got the note. She was not one to discriminate. She liked rabbits, she liked turtles, but she knew the difference. And she phoned the only person in the community that she thought could help remedy the situation. She phoned Emma Madison Bell, the granddaughter of Eli Madison, who was already in her 80s, who was a retired teacher, retired already some 40 years. And we called her Aunt Shine because everywhere she went, light followed. She was muscular in faith and in principle and in physique. And she came to the house, she took the letter, she started reading the letter, and she said, I need you to go to the kitchen. I need to talk to your grandparents alone. And I went to the kitchen, and I kept my ear to the door, and I heard my grandmother saying, what do we do? And Aunt Shine said to her, don't worry. We believe in resurrection. We believe in resurrection. And I grew up going to church every Sunday in this little Wobegon-like town, and I knew that before there was resurrection, there was crucifixion. And so I was like, oh my God, what's going to happen to me? And so they call me back in, and Aunt Shine says to me, and this is really important, she says to me, we believe in resurrection, and we're going to get you back to reading at a rabbit status. 3 days later, Sunday morning, everyone's at church because there's very little to do in a little town in Montgomery, Alabama, except go to church on Sunday. And Aunt Shine, unbeknownst to any of us, was recognized by the minister to come to the front of the church and to make a public service announcement. And she comes to the front of the church, she looks out over the congregation, and she says, brothers and sisters, last week, little Eric Motley, our little star, was demoted from rabbits to a turtle. But we believe in resurrection, and we are a community. And if he is struggling, that means many other kids in this community are struggling. And we'll get to that later. But for right now, we're going to focus on Eric, and I need your help. I'm going to be at his house this afternoon, and whatever reading matter you have, I want you to bring it by his house, because I'm going to build him a library. And Patrick, you would have thought that Sunday afternoon a paper drive was taking place at my house. My grandmother, my grandfather, and I, and Aunt Shine were all seated on the back porch receiving all the people in the town. And people brought what they had. Someone brought a 1945 almanac predicting weather that year, a 1972 Life magazine, a 1972 Ebony magazine, Volume L of Encyclopedia Britannica. Whatever you want to know about anything that begins with an L, I'm your guy. Leviticus, Leonardo. And that was all they had. They had Volume L, and they were sacrificially offering it to me. But someone also brought a beautiful volume of English verse, minus its table of contents, minus its index, but richly sewn with the works of Shakespeare and Keats and Byron and Yeats and William Wordsworth. And the frontispiece, had a wonderful excerpt from a poem. And my grandfather had me to write that out every day. It was the first book that I actually owned. Write it out every day. There was a time when meadow, grove, and stream, and every common sight to me did seem, apparelled in the freshness of a dream. As it were, it is no more. The rainbow comes and goes, and lovely is the rose. And this I know, where'er I go, that there has passed away a glory from the earth. Intimations of Immortality by William Wordsworth. I didn't know that at the time, but I was writing it out. But then Aunt Shine did something else. She solicited 3 other retired teachers, also in their 60s and 70s. Her sister, Carrie Madison Say, her other sister, Frankie Lee Madison Winston, her sister-in-law, Prinzella Madison, and they came by my house every day for 2 years, and they cleared the dining room table, excused my grandparents, and they gave me my own personal tutorial. And it started with my having to recite the preamble to the Declaration of Independence, the preamble to the Constitution of the United States, the entire Gettysburg Address, James Weldon Johnson's Lift Every Voice and Sing, and one or two things in Latin, because Aunt Shine actually knew Latin. And now that I know a little Latin, I realized that her Latin wasn't really Latin. And the Apostles' Creed. And she would say to me, "This is your birthright. Your grandparents were too poor to have anything else except the hopes and dreams of living in a place like Madison Park. You got to own these words. You got to understand these words. They got to make an impression in your heart and mind, and you have to live into them more fully."
Well, that's what is the legacy of the Eric Motley project in Madison Park? The group of teachers that got together, did that?
They ended up creating an after-school program. They focused on me because my grandparents were interested in me. Mm-hmm. My grandparents were making a real investment in me. And it wasn't just, I should put a footnote here, it wasn't just the black citizens who lived in Madison Park. My grandmother cleaned house for a lady, Mrs. Peabody, who lived in this wonderful area where she cleaned house right next door to where Zelda and F. Scott Fitzgerald lived when they lived in Montgomery. And this lady would send home the New York Times, because she said, "This is the best reading, Mamie. You got to take it home. Teach the boy how to read well and to write well." And then eventually she sent a crate of albums home, and it was my first introduction to opera, right? A long-playing album, crate of Maria Callas and Jesse Norman during Strauss's last 4 songs. I had a speech and debate teacher who took me on, who was white, who drove me around the city of Montgomery every weekend for competitions. But these retired teachers also created an after-school program, and I liken it now to the Harlem Renaissance. Every kid in the community came out. And Madison Park, remarkably, I want you to buy the book and read Madison Park. I don't want to tell you everything. But Julius Rosenwald was with Sears and Roebuck in Chicago, and he was a Jewish philanthropist. And he had heard about this remarkable guy named Booker T. Washington, who had founded Tuskegee Institute and was trying to educate freed slaves. And Julius Rosenwald, in Chicago, Jewish, very much involved in the cultural, decided that he would come down to meet Booker T. Washington and to support his school. Well, he later decided that he would build over 200 schools throughout the South and African American communities to help to educate freed slaves. And one of the first schools was in Madison Park, one of the first Rosenwald schools. And his proposition was, "I will give you half of the money to build the school. You will have to raise the other half of the money, and you will have to physically be involved, sweat equity, in the building of the school. You got to own it." And so my grandparents and everyone in this town grew up in this Julius Rosenwald school. And so they knew the value of education. They knew the value of a community in a school, or a school in a community. And one of their great cries, or a moment of great discontent for Aunt Shine, who could not fully comprehend everything historically, was that Brown versus Board of Education meant that the kids of Madison Park had to leave Madison Park in order to integrate the schools in Montgomery. And that the teachers in the Rosenwald School in Madison Park knew the names of every student. They knew their parents. They knew which kids' parents could read, which kids' parents could write, which kids' parents could provide them 3 meals a day. And so they were totally invested both in the intellectual development of these students, the moral cultivation of these students, but also the general welfare of these students. They knew how to teach them based on their own individual needs. And so you asked a question, all those years later, all of the kids of my generation were part of that second stream of kids who went away on the school bus, 25, 30 minutes every day on the school bus from this little town to integrate the schools in Montgomery, Alabama. And so for me, it was a plus for a whole number of reasons. I met different people, I understood different histories and cultures. I was exposed to ideas that I would not have been exposed to in Madison Park. But I also had these grandparents who were like totally committed to importing knowledge and importing people into my lives who could help me to develop. But there was an after-school program that lasted for about 4 years for all the kids in Madison Park, and we all benefited from that, and that was inspired by these retired teachers. Yeah,
that's great. I'm gonna fast forward now. As you know from Annie's introduction, Eric does become the designated undergraduate kid. You succeed, and you go off to Samford, which is an elite school in Alabama.
You thought he said Stanford, didn't you?
Yeah.
And I wasn't going to correct you.
Yeah. You arrive in a 1998 Grand Marquis, if I remember correctly. Yeah. And this is an entirely new environment in which you are, for the first time, truly separated from Madison Park and your grandparents. And one of the really interesting experiences that you relate in this book is pledging Sigma Chi. And I don't know if you could relate that story to us and what you learned from it.
88 miles away from Montgomery was Birmingham. And I wanted to go far away from home, but not too far because my grandparents were aging and I wanted to be near them. And so I get a scholarship, an academic full ride, and it's kind of the Amherst, Dartmouth of the South, and certainly Alabama. And when I was there were 5,842 students, and 11% of them were minority. That was black, that were people of color. And I knew that this was my one opportunity to take advantage of every opportunity to learn. I took as many courses as I could. I got up every morning at 5 o'clock. I was in the library every day. This was like, I got it. To whom much is given, much is expected. And so I arrive and I develop all these wonderful relationships. It's the first time that I had really been exposed to people from different states all across the country. Because at Robert E. Lee High School, where I went, everyone was from Montgomery, Alabama. And so I find myself in this great motley miscellany of people. And it was exciting and great teachers. And some friends encouraged me to go through Rush. And then they encouraged me to join. And I was so stupid that I didn't even think about how am I going to pay to be a part of a fraternity. That was just, and I was so naive. And so I end up going through Rush, and I'm eventually offered a bid to join Sigma Chi. And I naively thought, this is great. This is more about community. I came from Madison Park. I believe in community. I'm all about forming and living into community. And unbeknownst to me, there were a group of students who were big supporters of my being a part of Sigma Chi. And unbeknownst to me, no fraternity on this campus had ever been integrated. And I was joining a fraternity or being put up for a fraternity that had never been integrated in the state of Alabama. And so I discovered for the first time a group of students whose parents were resisting my becoming a member of this. And this is 1993. And so there are a group of students who decided that they would protest, but not to me, but to protest to other members of the fraternity, and had organized themselves to blackball me. And the night they took the vote, I was in my room, and I get a telephone call, and I pick up the telephone, and the person hangs up. And then I get another telephone call, and I'm hesitant to pick up the phone, and it's a voice that says to me, what you're doing, something along these lines, is courageous. Thank you. You are great. Regardless of what vote is taken tonight, you are a remarkable person. No vote can determine your value or your worth. You should remember that. And the person hung up. They took a vote that night. And a group of students were at the Final Four, and they discovered this divisiveness and that there was a group that was going to blackball, and they left early, and they drove all the way back from Chapel Hill back to Birmingham to arrive just in the nick of time. And these were seniors who all stood up, 3 or 4 of them, and they took off their fraternity pins, and they were all very well known. One was a quarterback, one was the president of the university's son. They were well-respected upperclassmen, and they took off their fraternity pins, and they put it on the table, and they challenged the other members in this fraternity to do what was right, and that they could not be a part of a community or a fraternity that was not willing to do what was right. Now, what is so remarkable about that story is two things. One is these group of seniors, 19 and 20-year-old students, had determined that they knew what was right, and they were going to stand up and do what was right, despite the popular tide, that the individual can make a difference. What was also rather remarkable was that I didn't learn about any of this until 2001, when I was working at the White House, and a former fraternity member who was a friend of mine was drunk and was sleeping on my couch and told me everything. And so, in retrospect, some of the best relationships that I formed, I later learned were with individuals who had opposed my being a part of that fraternity. And the day that President Obama was inaugurated, I get a telephone call. Now, I worked in the Bush administration. I get a telephone call from a parent of one of these students who had since died of an aneurysm. And she said to me, I can't help but to feel for you today, because this is one of the happiest days of my life that I never thought I would see. A black man becoming president of the United States. And this is a woman who lives in Alabama. And I just want to let you know what you meant to my son and what you in turn meant to my family. And one day I'll talk to you about what you did for my family. She was unaware that I was aware that she was the mother who moved her son out of the room of one of the individuals who had proposed me because she didn't want her son living with a lover. And all these years later, she had found her own sense of reconciliation and reached out to me. And I had just learned a couple of weeks earlier this entire narrative.
Wow.
Yeah. And I went on, I became president of the Student Government Association. I was asked to be president of the fraternity. I chose not to. And if you know anything about fraternities, I'm not your typical fraternity guy. But it ended up being, in retrospect, an even more rewarding experience than I even realized at the time.
Wow. Yeah. That's great. And then, as Annie mentioned, you continue to pursue knowledge. That is actually one of the defining elements of your career in life. And you go off to Scotland, which is now even further away from Madison Park. And I didn't know if you could talk a little bit about your experience in Scotland and what that did to your own thinking about the world.
Yeah. I want to give you a prelude to my arriving in Scotland. I'm packing my suitcases. I'm about to leave to go to the airport. My grandmother comes in and she says to me, I think you need to go outside. And I hear a lot of noise, and I go outside, and almost all of Madison Park was standing in the backyard. And I was hesitant to go to leave to go to Scotland because my grandparents, who I become, my mother was still on her own journey discovering herself. I had become the sole kind of responsible person in the family that was thinking about my grandparents' long-term welfare. And it was a very sad morning for me because I realized that in my leaving, I might not have the opportunity to say some real goodbyes. And I go out, and all of Madison Park is there. And the minister comes up, and he says a prayer. And he gives me an envelope, about $25 from the Baptist church, about $40 taken up from the Methodist, and the Church of Christ were somehow left out. A lady starts singing, Blessed Be the Tie That Binds Us. And someone gives me a Cool Whip container, Aunt B, a Cool Whip container of collard greens, just in case they don't have collards in Scotland. And someone else gives me a pound of iced potatoes. And Mrs. Beulah Bird a lady in the town who was really poor, who often couldn't take care of her own utility bills, who my grandparents had always told me never to take anything from her. If she offers you something, never take anything. And she reached out and she gave me a $5 bill. And I looked over at my grandfather and he was nodding, realizing that she wanted to be a part of this. And it was not until I realized the fullness of that moment, someone took out a map and laid it across the hood of the car, and they said, "Could you show us Scotland?" And as I made my way through the crowd, I got to the hood of the car only to realize that the map was a map of Montgomery. Not a map of Alabama, not a United States map, but for her entire life had been lived in Montgomery, Alabama. She couldn't comprehend life beyond Madison Park. And it dawned on me in many ways that I was like the astronaut being sent to outer space. I arrived to Scotland. I'm on a Rotary Ambassadorial Scholarship for 1 year. I have an incredible academic experience. I meet everyone. Helmut Kohl's grandson lived right next door to me. I'm invited one weekend to go home with another classmate who I know very little about, and then I get there and I realize that all of these flags are flying. We're going down this great drive, and I say to him, "Patrick, where I'm from, it's against the law to trespass." And he said to me, "We're not trespassing. This is my house." And I said, "That's your house." Just really containing my "Oh my God, that's her house. That's her house. This is usual to me, And he says, "No, that's the groundkeeper's cottage." I was like, "Yes, the groundkeeper's cottage." And then we meander, and this is in Carey Muir, the very place that J.M. Barrie wrote Peter Pan, lush and beautiful. And then we approach this wonderful, great castle with the moat around it and sheep grazing, and I could hear Handel in the background. At least I thought I could. And there are all these flags, and I get out of the car. Patty says, "I got to use the toilet." He leaves me standing there. A valet comes out in a kilt to help me with my luggage. And I asked the valet, "Sir, could you explain to me all the different flags? I know the Union Jack." And he says to me, that's Lord Patrick's father's office. And I'm thinking, Lord Patrick? This is Patty. And I said, "Yes, his office." And his office is what? I've forgotten. And he says, "He is the Earl of Airlie." Airlie is a region. And I said, "Wonderful." And he says, "You're probably going to ask me, what do you call him?" "Well, you could call him Lord Ogilvy." And I said, "Lord Ogilvy." And that name started to ring a bell. And I asked about the other flag. And he said, "Well, that's his official role." And I said, "In his official role?" "Yes." He says, "You do know that Patrick's father is the Queen's cousin who lives at Buckingham Palace when he's not here." So Patty's father was the Lord Chamberlain to Her Majesty the Queen, and his mother was a lady in waiting, the lady of the bedchamber. And I was like, "Oh, yes, the lady of the bedchamber." We had some bedchambers in Madison Park. And so they introduced me to this entire universe of people. And that wonderful weekend I was there, and it was 2 weekends before Princess Diana's death. And that weekend they had Sir Evelyn de Rothschild and his wife in residence, and they had the U.S. ambassador to the United States in residence. And it was a wonderful exposure. And at every turning, I kept meeting the most interesting people. And then the president of the university and his wife developed a real interest in me, and we became fast friends. And I later discovered that the president of my former university, Samford, had written a letter to the president of the University of St. Andrews that said something like, "There's a young man who has just come to the University of St. Andrews for 1 year, and he comes from a remarkably poor family, but he's determined to make life count. And we want to be able to assist him. So should you learn of his needing any financial assistance, please let me know, because we want to support him all the way." And so all of a sudden, this British university president, his own sense of concern has been quickened. And we became very good friends, and he and his wife decided they would start exposing me. And then there's this one day they invite me over for afternoon tea, and we're sitting in the garden, And Strother Arnott was his name. You can't make that up. Strother Arnott. And so Strother says to me, have you decided what you're going to do after your Rotary Ambassadorial Scholarship comes to an end? And I said, well, I'm thinking about going back to the U.S. and enrolling in the Kennedy School or Woodrow Wilson School and getting a PhD. And he said, you're thinking about it. You have less than 4 months before you graduate, and you are thinking about it. Everything that I know about you has been about forethought. It's been about action. And how irresponsible, this is what he's saying to me, how irresponsible of you not to have thought about this before your scholarship ends. I have to say I'm disappointed. So why don't you think about it just a bit more, and when you're ready to talk about it, come back for afternoon tea, and we could discuss your future. And then he turned to me and he said something that was remarkably politically incorrect, but he was British. He said, I don't want you to go back to your country and be offered a job because someone needs to fill a quota because of your brown pigment. I want you to go back because you feel sufficient in your intellectual development that you can compete with everyone else. So when you're ready for that challenge, let me know. And I went back so depressed because everything that my grandparents and everyone in this small town had done to invest in me, and this person was reminding me that I was about to let them down. I went back the next day, and we walked around the garden, and we had this very botanizing walk, and we walked around the garden, and he propositioned me, and he said, if you want to stay, I will underwrite your PhD so that you can get a full superior education. And I'll even provide you a book allowance. And you could go back knowing that you have a great education from the University of St. Andrews. And so I stayed, and I did my PhD. And I met people, I taught students, I engaged in a world of ideas with other scholars. I had my own theological and religious ideas challenged in a way that they never would have been challenged in a small town. The Apostles' Creed became something that was more than just a recitation of words, but a real treatise and examination of ideas. I came to appreciate my own sense of belonging in a community and what my responsibility was. And my entire intellectual aperture was expanded beyond anything that I ever comprehended.
Well, the role of ideas really is a big part of your life and your career now. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you see the role of ideas today in American society and how we, because one of the things that comes up across in your book is that, civil discourse, at least in your life, has been much more open and free. And today we seem to be, as you talk about, becoming more atomized as individuals, as communities, as individuals and communities are being torn apart. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the role of ideas today and how we could elevate ideas in our own national discourse.
I went back to Madison Park over Easter break, and I was at the White House, and my grandmother said to me, the first stop you have to make is to Aunt Shine. She most likely will not last a week. And I went back to Aunt Shine's home, and I went into her room, and she had not been talking. And as I was walking from my house to Aunt Shine's house, an enormous sense of pride overtook me. I'm a rabbit again. This is a woman who made this incredible investment in me. And I was just really, I've gotten a PhD from St. Andrews. I'm working at the White House. It's all because of her. And I'm standing at her bedside, and I'm not saying anything, and she looks up at me, and she says, so I guess you think that I should be feeling really good because you work at the White House. Well, I'm not. And he was not my president. I did not vote for him. That's what she said to me. It's like, and I guess you're feeling good because you have a PhD from a university over there across the ocean. Well, I am not. That does not impress me. What impresses me is your sense of responsibility, that to whom much is given, much is not expected, but is required. And so I need you to think about what you're going to do to give back. And that was one of those lessons that she and my grandparents constantly reminded me of, that the role of the educated individual in society is a very important and very vital role to the preservation of society and civilization. And so all of a sudden, I realized that I'd been given this wonderful idea to become a steward of values, American values, the values that my grandparents in Unshine taught me in the Declaration of Independence, but also the steward of ideas and beautiful ideas. What we know is that increasingly people are losing faith in institutions. Not just American institutions, but institutions all across the world. And for me, one of the greatest institutions is the institution of community. The institution of being a part of something where you share values and a commitment to each other's upward mobility. That you are a part of something. It could be your synagogue or your church. It could be the community in which you live in. However you define community. Mr. Richmond said to me this evening that Mr. Richmond's right there, that his community was Madison Park. Mm-hmm. And so really in many ways, for me, Madison Park is a metaphor of your own community, wherever you are. And I think individually, we each have the responsibility of creating community wherever we go. And being the force that creates that connective tissue. How many of you know your neighbors' names? How many of you know their stories and where they're from? One of the most wonderful and fascinating things that I like to participate in is getting in a taxi and talking to the taxi driver and asking him or her their narrative. And what you discover is that we all come from somewhere. We all have grandparents who came from somewhere, or great-grandparents who came from somewhere, who had very little or had something or had a lot, and they chose the place in which they settled. We all have a story. And so as I've been out on the road talking about Madison Park, what has been most beautiful and most affirming is that everyone has a Madison Park story. The taxi driver has a Madison Park story. The lady that I sat next to on the bus has a Madison Park story. And in the telling of our stories, we discover that we have more in common than not. And I actually think we're at an inflection point in this country where we need to hear more stories and be reminded of those things that really tie us together. We're all immigrants. We're all from somewhere. And we all want to be here in this country for some reason. Some of us came of our own desires, and some of us were brought here in protest. But we're here. And the fabric in which we are part of is a beautiful and complicated fabric. You know, I love books, and I love libraries. My grandparents were never allowed to go into the Montgomery Public Library. My mother was not allowed to go into the Montgomery Public Library. And then all of a sudden, I come along, and my grandfather insisted that I go into the Montgomery Public Library. And every Saturday morning, he would drive me to the Montgomery Public Library, but if he couldn't, he created this rotary of other neighbors. And they were farmers and plumbers and carpenters, and none of them had been in the Montgomery Public Library. And they would drive me, and they would sit in the parking lot, and I was totally insensitive, but I would stay in for about 3 to 4 hours, not realizing that they were just sitting out in the summer's heat of Alabama. And on this one occasion, my grandfather drove me, and he pulled up his Chevrolet Impala, and too poor to have air conditioning in the car. It was a July day, and didn't want to turn on the radio, fearing that it would run down the battery. And he would just sit and he would scribble in his notebook. And I was in the library for about 3 hours that day. And I would go in, and all the librarians knew me. And my grandfather couldn't go in psychologically and emotionally. It was just, all of his life, this was a place that he was told he couldn't go. And he couldn't muster the strength to go in. But I would go in. And I'd build these pyramids of books. And I would write, because when you can't afford books, you just kind of write everything down that you're interested in. And I would just write, and I would write. And on this particular day, the librarian came over to me, and she said, "You have an hour left, Motley boy." And I looked up, and there was an elderly man in a wheelchair staring at me. And then I noticed that he had a black gentleman standing at his side, a valet, turning the pages for him. He was unable to turn the pages himself. And I would look down, and he would look at me, and I would look at him, and he would look down, and this went on for about 2 hours. And then I got up to put some books away, and I came back, and I noticed that the black gentleman was over at my table looking at the books that I was reading, probably to convey to the gentleman in the wheelchair what I was up to. I came back to my seat, and the librarian came and said, "All right, Motley boy, time to go. The library's closed. Your granddaddy will bring you back next week." And I had this long stare with the wheelchair man. And he nodded. And I nodded. And I raced down the stairs, and I got to my grandfather's car, and I said, "Daddy, you'll never guess who I just met." And Daddy said, "Was it Robert Frost?" And I said, No, it wasn't Robert Frost. It was Shakespeare." And I said, No, it wasn't Shakespeare. It was George Wallace. History does not repeat itself, but it rhymes. And there in that one moment, it was as if he was coming to grips with the long arch of history. My grandfather sitting in the car because someone said segregation today, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever. And now George Wallace looking at the inheritor who's sitting across from him in the Montgomery Public Library, flipping pages that he himself can't turn. And it was a wonderful reminder that history has a long arch. Reinhold Niebuhr, the social philosopher, said, "Nothing that is worth doing could be accomplished in a lifetime. Therefore, we're saved by hope." Hope. Nothing that is good or beautiful makes complete sense in its immediate context of history. Therefore, we're saved by faith. And nothing, no matter how virtuous, could be accomplished alone. Therefore, we're saved by love. Love, for me, is community. And Madison Park, A Place of Hope, is a story about a people who had nothing except dreams and aspirations and hope. And they created a community. And they lived in that community. And they survived Reconstruction. And they survived Jim Crow laws in the 1950s and 1960s in Montgomery, Alabama. And they're still surviving because all the descendants are still there. I know the names of all the people of Madison Park and the history of Madison Park because every Saturday, in recompense to the tutorers teaching me, I had to go to the town cemetery with them to sweep the graves, to brush the pine straw from the graves. And Aunt Shine would take wisteria and honeysuckle, and I would carry milk jugs with water and a broom, and we would sweep every grave in the Madison Park Cemetery every Saturday. And it was there that I learned the names of every person who was buried. And she would say to me, "That is Emma Drain. She was a seamstress and a friend of Rosa Parks." And I would sweep just a bit harder. And that is Eli Madison's son, Arthur, who actually went to law school. And I would sweep just a bit harder. And it was there that I learned the narratives. And I came to know my friends' grandparents and great-grandparents. We got to go, I know, but I want to put a footnote. I'm hesitant to go to Scotland, and I'm away at Sanford, and I get a telephone call. And it's from a guy named William Winston, who's the son of Frankie Lee Madison Winston, who's one of the tutors. And he says to me, "I hear you're coming to town over the weekend. I want to talk to you. I want to meet you at the graveyard." And I thought, only in Madison Park is the meeting place a graveyard. And I meet him in the graveyard. And I get there, and he's already walking the length of the graveyard. And he comes up to me, and he says to me, "I hear you have some hesitation about going off to Scotland. And I can only guess it's because you don't want to leave your grandparents, who are now much older. And he said, I want us to go over to my mother's grave. And we walked over to his mother's grave. And he said, she made an investment in you so that you could go where no one else in this graveyard could ever go or imagine going. So you got to go. But you don't need to worry because this is a community. And we're going to take care of your grandparents. And I wanted to meet you here to let you know that we've already organized a plan to take care of your grandparents. That twice a day, people are going to go by the house. And I left, and I went away. And every day, twice a day, they went by the house. My grandfather died while I was in Scotland, and I came back, and all of Madison Park, 200 people were waiting at the house for me to arrive. And Madison Park and the descendants are still there. They're trying to make life work. They're trying to live into the dreams of the forefathers, as we all are. And about 5 years ago, they discovered, Patrick, that the graveyard in the town had reached its capacity. And there's a health and sanitation code, and the records of the city were different from the records of the town. And maybe we had too many people buried in that space. And they had to do an audit. And they stopped burials for about a year. And then they discovered that there were only about 6 graves left. And they created a trust. And 5 of those graves will go to the descendants of Eli Madison in a little plot. But a letter that I keep at my desk at the Aspen Institute in my drawer is a letter from the people of Madison Park telling me that you will always have a place in Madison Park. We've reserved a place next to your grandparents' grave for you to be buried.
Wow.
And so how can I not love this place that gave me the world and much more? And how can I not want to be involved in an enterprise like the Aspen Institute that is challenging people to realize that we do have more in common than not, and that we all have a social responsibility to challenge the moral complacency of a leisure society, and to challenge individuals to realize that we can do a lot by working together. And by working together, we can address some of the great intractable issues of society. And so
Yeah, that's great.
I still have hope.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think you've given us all a little hope, too.
Yeah.
Thank you. I think we have some time for questions from the audience. And if not, I have a whole slew of other ones I can ask you. Yes, sir. Yep. Yes, sir.
You're talking about the power of community, but yet the problems of today seem to be that young people, black or white, are alienated. They don't have a sense of community. It's not a matter of where you live, it's the people.
Yeah.
What do we do? Why can't we have a sense of community regardless of where we live or who we are?
This goes back to what I believe to be the individual's responsibility to create community. Madison Park was not a community. One person had a vision, and he invited a number of other people to join him in creating that vision. I arrived in Scotland, and let me tell you, I stood out in St. Andrews. There was me and there was Tiger Woods, and I was frequently confused for him. I decided, and I've decided everywhere I go, that I got to know the people that I'm in the room with. I got to know the people on my corridor in my condo. I got to know the people that are living around me in Washington, D.C., who are not of my own political background and persuasion. What my grandparents inspired in me was the desire to know more than myself and to know more than them. And so Little Madison Park, this wonderful little democratic enclave that was very self-reliant, that had kind of some Republican-esque values, in my opinion, they don't think so, challenged me to realize that you vote for the best person. And you got to know the people that you live with. I don't know. I don't have answers for the demise of a lot of our institutions. But I do know that the friends that I have and the people that I'm around who've decided that they're going to really step up and try to get to know people and to try to create the conditions for people to live in harmony. You know, We disagree to agree, and we agree to disagree. I don't know how many of my friends who are black are willing to join organizations where they're in the minority. But I do know a good number that have. I don't know how many of you who are Republicans go to have dinner and hang out with Democrats, or how many of you that are Democrats that seek out your Republican people in the office. I don't know how many of you who go to temple show up every now and then and pop your head into a church, or how many of you who are Christians. I just think that we have a responsibility to step outside of our comfort zone and to create community. I was at Samford, Birmingham, Alabama, and I was out trying to raise money for a student program, and I met this remarkable guy named Hal Abrams. And I sat down in his office to ask him for some money, and I saw on his desk a CD, and it was Rachmaninoff. And I said to him, "Oh my God," I said, "I love Rachmaninoff." And he says, 1, 2, or 3. And I said, "I'm assuming you're talking about the concertos," and it would be 3. And then I looked on his desk, and he had a lot of papers, and he said, "I'm learning Hebrew. I'm 65 years old, and I'm now retired, and I'm learning Hebrew." And I said, "I'm taking an Old Testament class." And he said, "Why don't you come with me to Temple Emmanuel next Saturday morning so you could meet my rabbi and go through some Hebrew classes with me?" And Hal Abrams and I talk, now he's 94, maybe 3 times a month. I go to synagogue. I go to temple. Because I realize that the Judaica, the Hebraic traditions and rituals have informed my own religious traditions. But it's only through experiencing the Hebraic that I truly can understand myself more fully and more completely. And so I think we have a responsibility. It's a hard responsibility, but you have to step outside of your comfort zone. The white teacher who drove me around the state of Alabama every Saturday morning to debate competitions would drive her white Mercedes into Madison Park. It was like a reversal of driving Mrs. Daisy, and she just insisted that I not sit on the back seat. Mm-hmm. And she would drive into the community of Madison Park, and all the heads would turn. And I was her student. And I've been in every one of her daughter's weddings. And so I went to a funeral the other day, and I thought to myself, how unfortunate that he didn't make more relationships with people who were outside of his community. And this is a friend of mine who is a contemporary, And I thought, I'm not married yet. I can't find myself at my wedding and everyone looks like me, sounds like me, and is from the same street and zip code. I would not have fully lived. And you're still alive. And so I would say to you, if you've not lived into that fullness of life, then tomorrow morning, go to Mount Zion Baptist Church and pop your head in and see what's going on.
Great. Well, thank you, Eric. I want to encourage everybody to learn more about Madison Park and Eric's experience by buying this book that is in the back. And Eric, I'm sure you'd be happy to sign
I would love to if you buy
volumes. Yeah. There's a cost of admission. There is one last quick question that I've been dying to ask you. As Eric mentioned, he is a great book collector. It's something that's actually not in this book. So everybody has to buy this book, but then when they go home and go on Amazon, if you could recommend one book that everybody should read, I'm sorry to put you on the spot here, what book was maybe the most influential for you, or the one that you think would be most appropriate for other people to read?
Besides John Lawrence, that's going to be on my bedside table tonight. I bring my interns together every close of every semester, and I make them watch one movie and listen to one piece of music, and then I give them all one book. We watch A Man for All Seasons together. Paul Scofield came out in 1967. The language is rich and beautiful. It's the language of law. When God made the angels, he made them to show him splendor, plants for their innocence and plants for their simplicity, but man he made to serve him wittily in the tingle of his mind. And that is when Margaret is saying to her father, Thomas More, you got to sign the edict. The king wants you to sign the edict. You know, it's about finding the loopholes. The piece of music is Glenn Gould's 1955 recording of the Goldberg Variations. And the book is Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, because it's all about the attitude. It's all about the way you choose to see the world and to experience the world in spite of your suffering, in spite of your, and I'll say this, my grandfather didn't read Man's Search for Meaning. He didn't know Viktor Frankl. My grandfather went away to fight in a war, World War II, in a country that he had probably never even heard of. And he came back to Montgomery after having fought for his commander-in-chief, and he couldn't drink out of the water fountains in the local parks or vote for his local officials. And he had so much to be upset about. And I never experienced any bitterness from my grandfather. I think one of his great gifts to me was that he always was searching for meaning out of pain, out of suffering, out of the past. He always had these great expectations because he had experienced the progress of history in remarkable ways, that he wanted me not to be preoccupied with the wrongs of the past, but totally aware of them, pragmatically speaking, but very much aware of the promise and that the role that the individual could play in creating that promise. And so, Man's Search for Meaning, if you've never read it, is a book that you should and must read because it will change your life and your own sense of meaning and your own sense of search. Thank you so much,
Thank you,
Pastor.
Eric.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Good. Thank you.